Mind blown when it comes to Final Fantasy VII. As I have said before, it is my absolute favorite game, dethroning my once beloved, and really still beloved, but not as beloved, Shadow of the Colossus. Final Fantasy VII Remake took me to a different place in time, as many of you guys probably experienced, particularly with that very, very different ending from kind of the core experience. It had phenomenal gameplay, phenomenal graphics, phenomenal pacing, and a phenomenal soundtrack. One that I absolutely adore and listen to on a daily basis. The fact that I have a external DAC for my PlayStation 5 with some performance Sennheiser headphones really got me even more immersed in the game than I think a lot of other people may have. And I just was really in awe of all the little detail that was put into everything on that game, from the way that gear sounded when you walked over metal that was hollow versus metal that was more rigid, the way that dirt sounded, the way that it caked up under your feet when you walked, the special effects, particularly when you called in some of the more elaborate summons. So when I was blown away by the game, and I still can't stop thinking about it. So when INTERmission came along, and that was my entry point into Final Fantasy VII, I bought it for PS5, and it came with the INTERmission DLC. I was particularly excited to see what would happen with Yuffie. Now, Yuffie is a main character in Final Fantasy VII. We didn't really know much of her background other than she was from a rival faction to Midgar from a place called Wutai. And she was obsessed with materia. She was a young, I don't want to say arrogant. Maybe arrogant is a good word. Definitely overconfident character who eventually learns to kind of settle down a little bit and become a pivotal member of the team as they battle through the rest of the story. The deal with Yuffie, though, in particular, was that she was very young, and a lot of her intentions never really seemed to be entirely clear. So this was an attempt from Square Enix to give her somewhat of a backstory, I think under the frame of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but her story picks up in Midgar and stays in Midgar while Cloud and the team are off getting ready to attack Shinra. Now, they haven't really been there yet. So she's going to head in totally independent. She doesn't really know much about Cloud or anything. She's actually working with the main group of Avalanche, not the rival offset faction that's led by Barrett Wallace. And it picks up with her and her colleague as they go in for the heist of the century to steal this ultimate materia from Midgar. Really from Shinra, I guess, technically. And the adventure is about them getting into trouble, finding their way in, and ultimately what secrets lie within. Now, I'm not going to spoil anything for you guys because there's a lot of other deep dive reviews on kind of what happened and why it happened and what does it mean. But I'll say this from a non-spoiler perspective. This game definitely did not give Yuffie a significant amount of backstory, which I was a little disappointed for because the adventure in of itself it's kind of mindless and kind of nonsensical. There are definitely some fun flashbacks to kind of the main game. There are definitely some cool intersections with characters at the end, but the main focus of the game revolves around Yuffie and a friend kind of doing meaningless things, really just trying to stay out of everybody's way inadvertently because they don't really want to mess up the core timeline of what happens with Cloud and company as they actually enter Shinra proper in the main game. So Square Enix kind of painted themselves in a corner when you have these conflicting timelines of finding a way to make things that happened in the past somehow still relevant enough that they push the story forward. And up until the end, I would say that this does not succeed in that at all. I didn't really know much more about Yuffie after the events of this DLC. Her companion was very stone-faced throughout the entire time. We get a brief flashback to some family trauma that he is dealing with, but it doesn't really ever culminate into anything save for maybe the last 30 seconds that we are engaged with both of them together on the screen. And even after that moment, the whole event and Yuffie's discoveries, I'll say, in Shinra's advanced weapon labs really kind of felt hollow. It didn't really resonate with me, and I didn't have any more or less appreciation for the character afterwards. What this DLC really, I think, was for, my opinion, was to experiment with Final Fantasy being more of an action-based game. So Final Fantasy VII Remake definitely was a big injection of action and a big difference from the turn-based combat we saw in the original game, right? But a lot of the things that you did, the way you fought in combat, the way you moved around and traversed with the world was still very Final Fantasy-esque. You walked on flat surfaces. If you had to climb a ladder, you walked over and pressed and hold forward. Your character would climb up. There was no jump button. There was no twitchy, I don't even want to say cutscene or quick time event kind of action. It was still very, very static in the way that the game moved. Not taking away from it, that's just what it was. I feel like with this DLC, Square was kind of taking a little chance to see like, hey, what if we made it a little bit more? What if Yuffie had a lot more climbing to do and there was way more platforming? Not necessarily jumping, but flipping levers, climbing up and down things, swinging on ropes. More like timing type of games. You know, you're on a conveyor belt and you have 30 seconds to shoot things on either side of you. Or you have to sneak up on something without making any noise, and there's a timed interval on how to do this. That's what it felt like to me. Doesn't take away from it. I think it honestly fits Yuffie's personality and what we knew of her from Final Fantasy VII quite well. A lot of it was very childish, and it was meant to be childish because Yuffie is a child. So her grand mission that she was set out to do, while very important in its own right, was handled in a very comical way. Like, we're going to go get the big bad weapon and beat up the bad guys, and trust me even though I'm a little kid because I know what I'm doing. And it was fun to root for Yuffie because she's just a very adorable character. But at the same time, it's hard to take anything she does seriously because the way they framed her adventure. And when you add in this over excess of gimmick and actions, and even her combat system, which was very, very different from what we saw from Cloud and Aerith, and you know the core Final Fantasy VII game. Her combat was very twitchy and aggressive. You'd throw something, then you could do magic at range, or you can do kind of more melee up close. You can hit multiple enemies at once to juggle them. Her summon ability, not her summon ability, but like her ultimate ability revolved, or basically her teammate like throwing her like a bowling ball almost into an enemy like really fast to try to hurt them. Very different style of combat, which again fits her character, but didn't really push the narrative of that deep, serious tone that I think Final Fantasy VII had looming over our heads, even though there was some fun moments with Don Corneo and stuff like that. And I'm okay with that. I'm not picking on that, but I just want to really say that to me, they could have done more with this. Now, where Square absolutely shines, of course, is in the post-credits when we are reunited once again with our heroes from the first game. They have now moved on to the next location. That is where it got very interesting, and that leads to many fan theories as to what we saw happen, paying particular attention to some of the destruction that is and is not in the background, paying particular attention to who is grieving and why and what is going on, I think may shed some light on what we can expect to see moving forward in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Obviously, Yuffie will eventually, just as kind of she did in the first game, stumble into these group of heroes before too long, and they will all unite, and it'll be interesting to see how her play style compares and contrasts against Cloud, who was much more of a straight-laced brawler. Obviously, Yuffie was much, like I said, her combat style was very, very different than what we expect to see, and I'd be really curious to see if the game designers allow Yuffie to either be a playable character or she's relegated to just kind of follower status like Red 13 was, where you can't really directly control her, but she's just kind of there, to help out. It'll be interesting to see some of those fight dynamics unfold as time goes on. And in this now current universe of Final Fantasy VII Remake, it'll be really curious to see if her intentions and motivations remain the same. I suspect that they will. She seems to be very focused on materia first and foremost, with building up her fallen Wutai the best that she can. Maybe we'll actually, you know, get a little bit more story in the main game than we did in the DLC, which would be kind of baffling, honestly. But it didn't fail. I guess I'll summarize with this. I don't think the DLC failed in telling an interesting story. It just didn't matter. And I don't think the DLC failed in making Yuffie a much more action-oriented package than the original game, because it is a different character, it is a different time. A lot of the assets and a lot of the play styles were utilized, and some of the areas you actually will explore were the same as they were in the main Final Fantasy VII game. It just goes to show how deep and how detailed the world is that Square built for us to explore. So I'm really curious when we go to some of these other locations just how different they look. Like the Gold Saucer is going to be mind-blowing. I feel like the Gold Saucer could be its own game at this point with all these mini games involved in there, because I have a feeling they're going to go way over the top, and just like they did with Midgar, just like we know they're going to do with everything else. I'm really excited for that. But the DLC in of itself doesn't really push the narrative in the way I want to, sans the last 10-15 minutes post-credit stuff. And it kind of gives us a sense of like, okay, now what happens? I guess for DLC, it did its job. Typically, you don't expect DLC to be this masterpiece, 20, 30-hour experience. I think I beat it in like 6 hours. I did most of the stuff that I think mattered. There may have been some ancillary stuff I missed. That's okay. I don't really have any desire to go back to play. I do want to go back and play 7 Remake again. I don't really have a desire to go back and play with Yuffie again, though. And I don't know if that's a testament to how phenomenal Final Fantasy VII resonated with me, or the way the music was, or whatever. But the DLC definitely didn't hit that feel of like, oh my God, I have to play this again. What am I missing out on? The way that the main game did. And lastly, I'll say that they also took a chance on the music design. While there were a couple familiar cuts in there, particularly around boss battles, and a little bit when you were exploring Midgar at the beginning of the game, this game had a wildly different soundtrack than Final Fantasy VII Remake. And while they did still adhere to the adaptive music, where the music kind of flared up during combat and then kind of faded out in the background, the music was definitely meant to emulate, I feel like, what Wutai music may have sounded like. However, there wasn't a lot of distinction or flair or feeling between each of the various tracks. They all kind of blended together after a while. And I think that is a disservice because part of what made Final Fantasy VII so good was the distinct soundtracks that conveyed such clear and gripping emotional response. This game, you don't get that. This game, you don't get that with the music for sure, because it is very samey. There's a lot of places where there's absolutely no music playing at all, which was kind of baffling. You just hear a lot of ambient noise, kind of like a Dark Souls game. You hear the whooshing or the metal creaking in the background if you're on a railing or something like that, or a catwalk or whatever, in some industrial area. But you never really get engrossed and engripped in the music, and I think that's kind of to its disservice. Ultimately, do I recommend it? Yeah, of course I do. It's more Final Fantasy. How could you not like it? Just understand the experience is going to be significantly shorter and significantly less impactful until the very end. And speaking of very end, you've reached the very end of this video. If you guys found this information fun or informative, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And until next time, I will see you guys on the other side.